I'm Ben Ward. I'm the co-director of the IoT Collaborative along with Nick, and I am housed in the Office of Research at Cleveland State University. And I'm delighted to introduce Ray Henry. Ray is a professor and the chair of the Computer and Information Systems Department in the Monte Ahuja College of Business. He's also the director of all the graduate programs in the College of Business, and conducts research in IT governance, knowledge management, risk, and a lot of other things. And amongst all that, we managed to carve out a little bit of his day to come talk to you today about IoT and data governance. So Ray.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for all coming out on this cold and dark and dreary morning. We didn't coordinate this, but my talk follows very closely on what Young Jin was talking about. If we're going to think about all of the possibilities, and I think that's what excites most of the people who are here and interested in IoT, is the possibilities, and that this interconnected world creates, and the ability to transform business processes in the way that Young Jin is talking about, moving from physical to data-driven, and all of the possibilities that that has for transforming so many things in society and in business and in creating value in different ways. And one of the things that drives that, and I think Young Jin was referring to this in the digitization and the focus on data, is what IoT creates is lots of data. And that data has this transformative property, and we can change business processes through that. But one of the questions that we have to ask is, how do we make sure that we're harnessing that data in a way that meets objectives, right? We have to think about, what are we trying to do with that? And that when we start thinking about questions like that, we're getting into the concept of governance. And when we're thinking about governance, while this is much more boring a topic than innovation, it's an important one, because we have to be able to harness this possibility to do things that we want to do. And when we're thinking about governance, we're thinking about, what directions are we setting? You know, how are we determining what the objectives are? And how are we establishing priorities? How are we making decisions about key things in governance at an enterprise level? We look at, how are we assessing value? What values are important to us? How are we deploying resources? How are we evaluating and mitigating risk? And how are we making those decisions? And then most importantly, how are we knowing whether these directions that we've set, we're actually achieving them? So how do we monitor and control that? Well, now we're setting up governance structures to make sure that those things are being achieved. And so when we think about governance, if we're talking about this data that's being created, we want to focus on data governance, which are decision rights and accountability for the information and data assets that are now the heart of the processes that we're talking about as we move from this physical, as Young Jin was talking about, to a digital. Now we have to think, how are we governing that? How are we making decisions about those data assets? Now, it's important to recognize that this data governance doesn't exist in a vacuum. Right? We think about our corporate governance. And corporate governance, I approach things from an organizational perspective, but this could be whatever boundaries we're putting around the group or collective or the entity that we care about the outcomes for. Right? So corporate governance is how we set direction. How do we determine organizational objectives? Who's setting those objectives? What processes are in place to do that? What mechanisms are we using that? Because there's a technology component, we often think about this in terms of the IT governance, which is, how do we align the technology capabilities with the organizational or broader objectives that we're trying to achieve? And then data governance becomes part of that, because as we move to the core of our business processes being these data elements, how are we reaping value from that? How are we addressing risks associated with that? And there are a number of risks that come about as we make this transition. Who's paying attention to that? And governance is about setting direction, but it's also about not being caught off guard. Because the worst problems to have are the ones that you don't know you have. And so when we think about what enables governance, right, we think about the processes. And when we think about the processes, Who owns those processes? Do we understand our processes? How are we measuring the performance of those processes? Do we have accountability if processes are not what we expect them to be? And that would be an evidence of a poor governance structures if you don't know, and if you don't know the answers to those questions. It also exists in organizational structures. Who gets to make those decisions? And understanding who gets to make that. Is that something that is done internally? Is it done externally? Is it done by certain divisions and not others? And this comes up a lot in the IT context, where we have the IT function within the organization that focuses on technology, and then we have the business side of the organization that's focusing on value creation and pricing and other things like that. And how are we aligning the capabilities of the technology with what we're trying to achieve? And a lot of that comes down to who's making those decisions, who's in the room. And when we start thinking about those things, we're thinking about governance. It's also in the expectations that we have. Even this idea of culture, ethics, and behavior, recognizing if we do see this transformation from physical processes to digital processes, is that something as an organization we've embraced? Is that something that from the top to the bottom we recognize that we're in a different environment, so we're not basing our assumptions on business models that aren't actually our drivers anymore? And then how we deploy resources. Once again, who gets to make the decisions about how we deploy those resources? And these are the considerations that we have to make. So when we think about data governance, we can also think about the types of decisions that are part of that, right? So we have this key resource, this main driver of value creation being data, being this digitized, encoded. Well, now that research, how are we using and evaluating that, and what decisions? And we can think about different types of decisions. We can think about the data principles. How are we viewing this as an asset? What is its value proposition to us? And establishing that at an organizational level. Once again, organization doesn't have to be a business enterprise. It can be whatever organizational boundaries are important to us. It could be for governments, it could be municipalities, whatever that is. And so who's establishing what those principles? Who's determining what matters to us and where we're going to prioritize value? Who gets to determine characteristics of data quality? Who's paying attention to that? Who determines what talks to what? And when you start to think about your own experience with IoT, probably some of these decisions, you're like, oh yeah, this ecosystem or this component doesn't easily talk to that. Who made that decision that we would use this and not this? Right? And so you can see that these are real decisions that come up in organizations. Here's a very important one, data access. All this data, who has access to what data? And what levels of security are essential? And these are decisions that you have to make. I mean, you're not going to have security processes unless you decide to have security processes, which means somebody has to make that decision. Somebody has to assess those risks and decide that that's worth investing in, or that is a risk that we need to mitigate. Well, when you're thinking about those things, you're thinking about the governance structures that surround these exciting and innovative processes so that you're harnessing them to make sure that they're getting the outcomes that you want and that you know what outcomes you want to guide them in that direction. Because governance actually comes from the Greek word to steer, right? So we're steering what we're doing by paying attention to the underlying questions that are essential to harnessing this. We also have to think about the data lifecycle, right? We can keep collecting data forever. At what point do we transition data? Do we retire data? Does data have a shelf life? And then who's managing that? Who's overseeing that? Right? Because that's another important part of governance is how are we making sure that the things we care about are getting done. And so that's an important part. And so really what governance helps us do, and having governance structures and paying attention to governance and thinking about governance, is about asking the right questions. Who owns this data? We have all this data out there. Who owns it? And when we think about ownership, we can also think about stewardship. Do they have certain obligations? And if they do have these obligations, do we have mechanisms to enforce that they are performing in a manner that it helps us achieve the objectives and the priorities that at an organizational level we've established? Who's paying attention to data quality? Who's paying attention to security? Do we have processes in place that we are monitoring to make sure that that's happening? What key business objectives are we actually achieving with what we're doing? And who's getting to make those decisions? And then if there are other things that we're doing with that data outside, right? So we have all this data. Who gets to play with it? Who gets to mine it to see what stories it tells us? These are governance questions. These are questions that if you don't establish those procedures and don't understand that this is going to happen, right? That these decisions are going to be made, and they should be made by the people that should be making them. That the right people should be in the room. That the outcomes of those decisions should be paid attention to, so that we know, is this helping us get to where we want to go, or are we going on any path? That's the underlying story that governance is focused on. And we have to ask those questions. And some of the biggest pitfalls that I see and that we can find in the literature and in examples is not paying enough attention to all of the stakeholders and not involving stakeholders and recognizing that setting this direction is about meeting stakeholder needs. So knowing who all the stakeholders in our processes, in our organization are, and having our governance structures and our approach to governance identify and help us meet those needs. Underestimating security and privacy implications. We have all this data. It's very exciting. It lets us do a lot of new things. If we don't have somebody putting the brakes on and saying, wait a second, this exposes us to risk. Well, that's a problem. And it's a governance problem. And usually governance problems show up when something bad happens. It's, why didn't somebody catch that? Well, having good governance structures is about recognizing that we need to have somebody taking ownership of those issues so that they don't catch us by surprise. And also balancing the issue of too little or too much control. Too much control and you stifle innovation. Too little control and you expose yourself to unnecessary risk. So these are the issues that organizations have to wrestle with in creating governance structures that harness the potential of IoT and produce all the business value that Young-Jin was talking about and the excitement, but doing it with a measured approach that asks the right questions and recognizes that this needs to be done to achieve objectives, so we have to know how those objectives are being set and measure and monitor our performance relative to those. That's all I've got, so thank you very much.